Hare Krishna. Now let us see the beginning, evolution and structure of the universe. Around 2500 years back, Plato, the great Greek philosopher, who is considered to be one of the first astronomer, he presented the geocentric earth-centered model, keeping earth in the center and informing us that all the planets are moving around earth in a circular fashion. Eventually Aristotle supported the same theory and explained it in a more understandable way. Later on, adding mass to it, he explained the movement of all the planets in the geocentric model. So this theory, which is based on the combined efforts of three people, Plato, Aristotle and Ptolemy, was accepted by all people and supported by the church over a period of 1000 years. But later on, in 15th century, Copernicus came and tried to present a sun-centered heliocentric model, wherein with the help of this model he thought that he could explain which is not explained by geocentric model about the retrograde motion of various planets such as Mars, etc., etc. But later on, when Galileo presented the observations and recommendations by Copernicus in the public forum, church warned him not to propagate something against to the traditional geocentric model. But in not listening to the church, Galileo did further research in this area, and later on in 1632 he presented a book based which is titled the Two World Systems, promoting heliocentric model. But church arrested him and they wanted to burn him alive in his house itself, but somehow he escaped. Eventually he died. But later on, Brahe, taking the works of Copernicus and Galileo, he published in a scientific way the understanding of heliocentric model, and he also presented about the moon's orbit, which is very close to earth. And eventually Kepler presented that all the orbits are not in circular fashion, but they are in ecliptic circles, ecliptic orbits. And finally Sir Isaac Newton, proposing his Newton's theories, he eventually introducing the gravitational principle, he made the system completely very simple and easy to understand to each and everyone. Even now, the model of Newton's is accepted as authentic in the matter of astronomy. On the other hand, Charles Darwin, after doing extensive research over 30 years, wherein he traveled all over the world based on his observations, he published a book known as Origin of Species, wherein he explained about the evolution of different species. On the other hand, many great scientists who have always dwelled into the subject matter of the beginning of the universe, and they thought about it, how it could have happened long back, etc., etc., etc. But eventually they come up with a theory known as Big Bang theory, which has its origin on a singular point, and by whose explosion, the entire universe has become the way we see now. So this happened to be around 13.8 billion years back, and many other theories came contradicting to Big Bang theory and supporting to Big Bang theory. But there was a study made based on empirical evidences, and everyone accepted Big Bang to be more authentic than steady state theory. Later on, Edwin presented his Hubble constant, and with which so many other details about the solar system, nebula, galaxy, and etc., etc., so many things about the entire universe have become widely prominent in all over the world. Thus, by the effort of many scientists in the recent past, we come across the understanding of this universe, how the universe has been created, how the universe has become the way it is now, and how the living species have been evolved, and how the things are happening in the outer space. In this slide we can see that things are categorized into three different colors. Initially the white color, which talks about the astronomy, and in between the orange color talks about the origin of species and their evolution, and then the bottom portion talks about the origin of the universe. These three theories, though they are very popular in our academic circles and media. So, explanation of these three theories from Vedic point of view is the main subject matter of our discussion. So these are the three modern day popular theories. The very first one being the Big Bang theory, which happened about 13.8 billion years back. So some details about this Big Bang theory, which we can come across in our studies. So after the event of Big Bang, which took place around 13.8 billion years back, wherein a singular point which is having infinite mass, infinitesimal volume, and infinite temperature, which exploded, and after that explosion, eventually everything became cooler, cooler, cooler. Over a period of time, temperature has gradually reduced, and new nucleus formed, proton, neutron, electron formed, atoms formed, and eventually atoms became different elements. Helium formed, hydrogen formed, and like that many elements have been formed. Eventually all the elements come together, it transformed into big planets, and all the planets come together transformed into solar system. Other solar systems combined together formed into a nebula and galaxy, etc., etc. The outer sky that we see in the night has been formed. And the same thing we can see here also, how time made everything that we see today for the period of thousands of billions of years. So this is what we see every night in the outer sky. and eventually, so those that we see in the outer sky primarily consisting of the solar system, which consists of various planets starting with Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, which are revolving around sun in ecliptic elliptic orbits that we can see below here. So these theories have been very much prevalent. In the beginning, everyone was talking about geocentric theory, wherein Earth is center and all the planets are moving around Earth. But with the introduction of Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, etc., etc., now we all read in our school text that Sun is the center of our solar system, and all the planets are revolving around Sun, and Sun, along with the entire solar system, also revolving around so many nebulas, galaxies, etc., etc., etc. So this is how the understanding have been evolved in the subject matter of the planets.
As our nebula began to collapse under its own gravity and spin faster, a dense clump of matter formed in the center. It's called a protostar. At first, its heat was due to friction, but when the clump reached 18 million degrees Fahrenheit, nuclear fusion kicked in. 4.5 billion years ago, our star was born. Hydrogen atoms fuse together to form helium, and in the process, release photons. It's the first light made by our sun, and it will keep on shining for 4 billion years. A vast nuclear furnace nearly 1 million miles across. From a distance, this process seems almost peaceful, with the sun's power gently radiating out into the early solar system.
There was all sorts of activity going on. Things were changing rapidly, violence, explosions, intense radiation. We had a pretty spectacular origin, I think.
Recent research suggests the solar system's birth was far from peaceful. Our sun may in fact have been born out of one of the most violent events in the cosmos: the explosive death of another star. And even before that, it seems there was an explosion so huge that it created an entire universe. The Big Bang. No one knows what caused it, but we think that the Bang created space, time, and all the matter in the universe. Yet for astrophysicists, such as Professor Stan Woosley, there's a puzzle. The Big Bang produced almost none of the 88 naturally occurring chemical elements.
When we look around, we don't just see hydrogen and helium. We see planets and people, and we're made out of carbon and oxygen, and planets are made out of iron and silicon. And that didn't all come from the Big Bang. It had to come from somewhere else.
Here on Earth, we have learned how to create new elements for ourselves. Nuclear technology. The same thing happens inside stars. Hydrogen and helium from the Big Bang fuse to form heavier elements. And if the star is big enough, at the end of its life, it does something spectacular. It explodes.
The energy of a supernova explosion is essentially equal to all of the energy that the sun will put out in its 10 billion year lifetime.
Now, the evolution of species, which Charles Darwin proposed in his book known as The Origin of Species, wherein he principally talks about struggle for existence, natural selection, and divergence. These are the three principal subject matters which he talks in his book. So this is we see about 4.56 billion years back, the nucleus has been formed. Then eventually the Earth formed, and then Moon formed, and so many things like strata and living organism, single cellular object, bicellular object, and multicellular object, eventually culminating with the formation of the highly complex, highly intellectual human being. Here we can see how the evolution took place, starting with single cellular object, multi, bi, and etc., 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 starting with reptiles, aquatics, and mammals, and then eventually terminating with human beings. So thus from starting with water, living entities have been evolved. Here we can see a little bit inside. So the sun ignites in the beginning, and earth formed, and moon formed, and cells without nucleus formed in the beginning, and then atmospheric oxygen formed, eventually bacteria, protozoa, and fungi, corals, etc. etc. Some living organisms like plants, etc. formed. Then eventually fishes, the aquatics were formed, and then insects and reptiles were formed, and then dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and flowers and bees were formed eventually. And then in the very recent Homo sapiens, the human beings have been formed around 1 million years back. And then later on, around 10,000 years back, writing has been invented, and then now we are called as so-called highly intellectual human beings with so many scientific developments around us.
1835. The Galapagos Islands. Young English naturalist Charles Darwin collects animal and plant specimens for study. His observations on these islands will be fundamental in formulating his theories, which many years later will be published in his great work On the Origin of Species. A revolutionary book that changed the way biology was understood, giving rise to new scientific theories. In this book, Darwin laid down the scientific principle that each species had not always been the way we know it today. Rather, each one had changed and altered over time. Three concepts are important for understanding Charles Darwin's theories: natural selection, evolution, and the origin of species. In animals and plants, random trait mutations and modifications can appear. For example, a moth that is born a different color than its parents. Imagine that this mutation or new trait improves an animal's ability to survive in its environment. Animals with this favorable trait would be better adapted to where they live and have a better chance to feed themselves and to reproduce than other animals of the same species without that trait. The offspring of parents with favorable characteristics will normally inherit those same characteristics. So, generation after generation, a trait that was rare occurs more frequently, becoming the norm within the species. This process is called natural selection. With the passing of time, these favorable mutations accumulate and species change, constantly adapting to an environment that never stops changing. Here's how the evolution of species takes place. Two groups of animals of the same species that adapt to two different environments over time can come to constitute different species. This way, a process as simple as natural selection helps us to understand the origin of species. Charles Darwin was one of the most important men of his era, and many consider him among the most influential scientists in history. His theories on the origin and evolution of species were very new for his time and are still studied and discussed to this day. Darwin died in 1882. His legacy changed the thinking of an era and opened the door to a new way of understanding science, the world, and the role humans play on this planet.
And then so we have seen this is the modern development in the matter of origin of universe, origin of species, and the workings of the universe. How do we harmonize about the descriptions given in the modern science and also the descriptions given in Vedic literature? So there are many followers of Srila Prabhupada try to harmonize these two things and try to explain the Vedic understanding in a scientific way and scientific understanding in a Vedic way. So one of the followers of Srila Prabhupada, he is Dr. Michael Cremo. He did lot of research in the subject matter of archaeology. So he always says that there is so much archaeological survey has been done about the existence of human beings much before than what we read in our school texts or media, etc. So he published various books based on his research. They are called as Forbidden Archaeology, Human Hidden History of the Human Race, and Human Devolution. Such as books published by him. He always travels all over the world and talks about the existence of human species much before. So he, the author of Forbidden Archaeology, the Hidden History of Human Race, wherever he goes, he presents on the compelling case for negotiating a new consensus on the nature of reality based on scientific evidences and also Vedic observations. He often says, I see a new consciousness emerging that integrates science and religion into a cohesive paradigm of reality. He sees both science and Vedic literature are non-different. Both are talking about the same thing but in different terms. So he further says, I do not believe that one group of scientists, even if they are a big majority, have a right to exclude the views of other scientists and researchers from the science curriculum in the education system. This presents a false view of the realities in the science world and it disrespects the value of intellectual freedom. I ask them to work for change in the science curriculum to include all the alternatives. He says that only a majority group of people who are in the scientific community who has power and influence have ability to promote their theories, but those who do not have power and influence they could not present their theories in front of common public. So he presents that let us include in our educational curriculum all the alternatives of the beginning of universe, beginning of the species and the workings of the universe. So let the student, let the reader try to understand and evaluate vis-a-vis and finally come to a conclusion what is correct, something like that. So now, taking inspiration from his talks and discussions, we are trying to come up with a understanding or alternative way of explaining the same modern theories as per the Vedic literature. So we are entitling our presentation as Bhagavata Cosmology, Vedic alternative to modern astronomy. So we are trying to present an alternative to modern astronomy. Let the readers, let the viewers try to understand it and compare it vis-a-vis with the modern understanding and come to a conclusion yourself. So in the beginning, let us get into the introduction of the subject matter which is explained in the second and third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, which is called as primary and secondary creation.